The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly over Tucson's dusty main street as Margaret Hartford stepped out of Kellner's general store, her modest brown dress already clinging to her skin despite the early hour. At 34, she had learned to move through the world with careful precision, her steps measured, her voice soft, her presence unremarkable. The heavy canvas sack of flour in her arms and the worn leather purse at her wrist told the same story she'd been carefully crafting for 3 years, a struggling widow making do on whatever her late husband had left her. The truth, locked away in a San Francisco bank account, was far different. But in a territory where a woman with money drew the wrong kind of attention, Margaret had chosen invisibility over honesty. She paused on the wooden sidewalk, adjusting her grip on the flour sack, when the commotion erupted near the saloon. Harsh laughter cut through the morning air, followed by jeers and the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Margaret's stomach tightened as she recognized the particular cruelty in those voices, the kind that came when men felt justified in their meanness. "Look at this fancy Indian," bellowed Tom Rawlings, a thick-set cowboy whose family ran cattle on the outskirts of town, "all dressed up like he thinks he's white folk." Margaret moved closer despite herself, her conscience warring with her careful instinct to avoid trouble. Through the growing crowd, she glimpsed the target of their mockery, a tall Apache man in his late 20s, wearing clean but simple clothes, cotton shirt, dark trousers, and worn but polished boots. His long black hair was neatly tied back, and despite the dust now coating his knees, he maintained a dignity that seemed to infuriate his tormentors further. "Joseph Crow Feather," she whispered, recognizing him now. He'd done odd jobs around town for months, always polite, always keeping to himself. She'd seen him reading newspapers outside the post office, heard him speak perfect English to shopkeepers, watched him handle horses with a skill that made seasoned cowboys take notice. "You think you can just walk down our street like you own it?" Rawlings shoved Joseph hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward into the hitching post. "This here's a white man's town, savage. You'd best remember your place." Joseph straightened slowly, his dark eyes never leaving Rawlings's face. When he spoke, his voice was calm, educated, which only seemed to enrage the cowboys more. "I was simply walking to the livery stable, Mr. Rawlings. I meant no offense." "The way you talk makes me sick," spat another cowboy, this one younger with the cruel enthusiasm of someone eager to prove himself, trying to sound all high and mighty. "But we know what you really are, don't we, boys?" The crowd murmured its agreement. Margaret noticed how quickly people had gathered, how eager they seemed for this entertainment. Even Reverend Matthews stood watching from across the street, making no move to intervene. Her hands tightened on the flour sack until her knuckles went white. Rawlings pulled a bottle from his coat pocket and uncorked it with his teeth. "Maybe you need to remember how to act like the animal you are. Get down on your hands and knees, Indian. Show us how your kind really belongs." "I won't do that," Joseph said quietly. The words hung in the desert air like a challenge. Rawlings' face darkened, and Margaret saw his hand drift toward the gun at his hip. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing violence about to unfold. A few women pulled their children back, but most stayed, their faces eager with the ugly anticipation of seeing someone brought low. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her comfortable boarding house, her carefully maintained anonymity, the peaceful life she'd built by never taking sides, never standing out. She thought of her secret fortune and how precarious her position really was in this harsh territory, where a woman alone was always just one scandal away from ruin. But she also thought of her late husband's words, spoken years ago when they'd first arrived in Arizona. "Maggie, there comes a time when keeping quiet becomes the same as being complicit. You'll know it when you see it." She saw it now. "Mr. Rawlings," Margaret called out, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "I believe you're blocking my path." Every head turned toward her. Rawlings blinked in confusion, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "What's that, Mrs. Hartford?" Margaret stepped forward, her flour sack held like a shield against her chest. "I said you're blocking my path to the livery stable. I have business there, and I'd appreciate it if you'd move aside." "This ain't your concern, ma'am," Rawlings said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. Even in their cruelty, these men had been raised to show deference to white women, and Margaret was counting on that ingrained behavior to protect them both. "On the contrary," Margaret replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Any disturbance on our main street is every citizen's concern. Surely you can settle your differences without creating such a spectacle in front of the ladies and children present." She gestured toward the crowd, reminding them of their audience. Several of the women nodded approvingly, and she saw Rawlings's supporters begin to shift uncomfortably. The dynamic was changing, and everyone felt it. Joseph remained motionless, his eyes moving between Margaret and his tormentors. She could see the wariness in his expression. He understood as well as she did how quickly her intervention could make things worse for both of them, but Margaret had made her choice. "Mr. Crowfeather," she said, using his name deliberately, "I believe you mentioned you were heading to the livery stable. Perhaps you could walk with me. I have a matter to discuss regarding my horse." The lie came smoothly, and she saw the slight widening of Joseph's eyes before he nodded gravely. "Of course, Mrs. Hartford. It would be my pleasure." Rawlings looked between them, his face flushing red with frustrated anger. "Now hold on just a minute. Thank you for your understanding, gentlemen," Margaret said firmly, then turned toward Joseph and inclined her head slightly. "Shall we?" For a moment that felt like an eternity, the street held its breath. Then Joseph stepped forward, careful not to touch her, and fell into step beside her as they walked toward the livery stable. The crowd parted reluctantly, their murmurs following the unlikely pair down the dusty street. Margaret's legs felt unsteady beneath her long skirts, but she kept her pace measured, her head high. She could feel every eye on them, could practically hear the gossip beginning to spread like wildfire through the small community. She had just publicly allied herself with an Apache man against white cowboys. In 1882, Arizona, such an act was not merely scandalous, it was dangerous, and she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do next. They walked in silence until they reached the livery stable, the weight of curious stares following them every step. Margaret's heart still pounded from the confrontation, and she could feel the tremor in her hands as she adjusted her grip on the flour sack. The stable's dim interior offered blessed relief from both the scorching sun and the scrutiny of the townspeople. Joseph stopped just inside the entrance, maintaining a respectful distance. "Mrs. Hartford," he said quietly, "you didn't have to do that." Margaret set down her flour sack and turned to face him fully for the first time. Up close, she could see the controlled tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself, ready to defend or flee at a moment's notice. His dark eyes held intelligence and something else she recognized, the exhaustion that came from constantly having to prove your right to exist in a world that questioned it daily. "Perhaps not," she replied, "but I couldn't stand by and watch it continue. You've made enemies today. Tom Rawlings won't forget this, and neither will his friends." Joseph's voice carried the weight of experience. "In a town this size, that matters." Margaret nodded, the reality of her situation beginning to settle over her like dust after a windstorm. She thought of her boarding house, her 3 current tenants, the careful balance she'd maintained to keep her business respectable. "I'm aware of the consequences." "Are you?" Joseph asked, and there was no challenge in his tone, only genuine concern. "Mrs. Hartford, with respect, you're a woman alone in this territory. Your reputation is everything. What happened out there, people will talk." The stable owner, old Pete Kowalski, emerged from a back stall leading a bay mare. He glanced between them, his weathered face carefully neutral. "Morning, Mrs. Hartford. Mr. Crowfeather." He paused, and Margaret could see him processing what everyone in town would soon know. "Everything all right?" "Fine, Pete," Margaret said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I was wondering if you might have time to check my mare's left front shoe. She seemed to favor it yesterday." It was another lie, but Pete nodded without question. "Sure thing. Bring her around tomorrow morning, and I'll take a look." After he disappeared back into the stalls, Joseph spoke again. "You're protecting me still. Why?" Margaret considered the question, studying this man who'd maintained his dignity even when faced with humiliation. "My husband used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." Margaret's voice softened. "Charles died 3 years ago. Pneumonia took him that winter. He would have hated what happened out there just as much as I did." Joseph was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple sincerity in his words caught her off guard. She'd heard countless condolences over the years, but most felt obligatory, empty. This felt different. "Thank you." She paused, then found herself asking, "What will you do now?" Rawlings meant what he said about this being trouble for you. "I'll manage. I always have." Joseph's jaw tightened slightly. "Though I may need to find work elsewhere for a while. Let things settle down. Where will you go?" "There's a ranch about 20 miles south. The owner's fair. Judges a man by his work, not his blood. I've done jobs for him before." Margaret felt an unexpected pang at the thought of him leaving. That seems unfortunate. You shouldn't have to leave because of today. Mrs. Hartford, Joseph said gently, I learned long ago that should and reality are often very different things, especially for someone like me. The bitterness in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret found herself studying his face, noting the way he carried himself, educated, articulate, caught between worlds in a way that must be exhausting. You went to school, she said. It wasn't a question. Joseph's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. 12 years. They had a motto. Kill the Indian, save the man. He paused. I'm not sure they succeeded at either. The pain in those words made Margaret's chest ache. She'd heard of such schools, places where Indian children were sent to be civilized, stripped of their language, their culture, their connections to family. That must have been very difficult. It was. Joseph looked toward the stable entrance, where harsh sunlight streamed across the dusty floor. When I came back, my own people sometimes looked at me like I was a stranger, and white folks, well, you've seen how they look at me. Not all of us, Margaret said quietly. Their eyes met and something passed between them, a recognition perhaps of shared loneliness, of understanding what it meant to not quite fit into the world around you. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy boots on wooden planks moving with purpose. Joseph tensed immediately, his body shifting into a defensive posture. Mrs. Hartford? The voice belonged to Sheriff Morrison, a decent man but one who valued peace above justice. He appeared in the stable entrance, his badge catching the light, his expression troubled. I need to speak with you. Margaret straightened her shoulders. Of course, Sheriff. Morrison glanced at Joseph, then back to her. Privately, if you don't mind. Mr. Crow-Feather was just leaving, Margaret said, though she made no move to dismiss Joseph herself. Joseph nodded respectfully to the sheriff. Mrs. Hartford, thank you for your assistance today. I appreciate your kindness. The formality in his tone was a shield, she realized, protecting them both. Of course, she replied, matching his formal tone while her eyes conveyed what she couldn't say aloud. After Joseph left, Sheriff Morrison removed his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. Margaret, what the hell were you thinking out there? The use of her first name told her how serious this was. In public, Morrison was always proper, always respectful. This was a friend talking, not just a lawman. I was thinking that what those men were doing was wrong, Bob. Wrong or not, it wasn't your place to interfere. You've got Rawlings and his boys all riled up, and some of the other folks are talking too, saying you've got unnatural sympathies. Margaret felt her temper flare. Unnatural sympathies? For not wanting to see a man humiliated in the street? For defending an Indian over white men, Morrison said bluntly. Margaret, I know you've got a good heart, but you're walking a dangerous line here. This is Arizona territory, not some fancy eastern city. People have long memories and short tempers. Are you threatening me, Bob? I'm warning you, as a friend. Morrison's voice was grave. Tom Rawlings is already talking about how you've been corrupted somehow, and there's others starting to listen. You run a boarding house, Margaret. You depend on the good opinion of this community. Can you afford to lose that? The question hit home because it was exactly what she'd been asking herself. Her boarding house was her cover, her explanation for how she survived without obvious means of support. If she lost her reputation, she'd lose her business, and with it, the careful fiction that protected her true circumstances. But the alternative, backing down, apologizing, pretending that what happened today was acceptable, felt impossible. I appreciate your concern, Bob, she said finally, but I won't apologize for doing what I believed was right. Morrison studied her face, then sighed heavily. I was afraid you'd say that. Margaret, just be careful, please. There's talk of organizing some kind of committee to discuss community standards. You don't want to be their first example. After the sheriff left, Margaret stood alone in the stable, the weight of her choices settling around her like desert dust. She thought of Joseph's words about courage, of her carefully constructed life, of the secret bank account that could take her anywhere she wanted to go. But as she picked up her flour sack and prepared to face whatever awaited her in town, she realized that for the first time in 3 years, she felt truly alive, even if it might destroy her. The first sign of trouble came at dawn, 3 days after the incident on Main Street. Margaret woke to the sound of her chickens squawking in distress and found 2 of them dead in their coop, their necks wrung. The gate hung open, though she distinctly remembered latching it the night before. A message, subtle but clear. She buried the chickens behind her boarding house as the sun climbed higher, her hands steady despite the fear gnawing at her stomach. Her 3 tenants, Mr. Weatherby, an aging prospector, Mrs. Chen, a Chinese laundress, and young Tom Miller, a clerk at the bank, had all found reasons to avoid her eyes at breakfast. The silence around her table spoke louder than any condemnation. By mid-morning, the community's response became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, wife of the bank president and self-appointed guardian of Tucson's moral standards, arrived at Margaret's front door with 2 other women in tow. "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice dripping with false concern as she settled into Margaret's parlor without invitation. "We need to have a conversation." Margaret served tea with steady hands, though she noticed how the women avoided touching anything they didn't absolutely have to. Mrs. Thornton's companions, Mrs. Rawlings, Tom's mother, and Mrs. Fletcher, the preacher's wife, sat stiffly on her carefully maintained furniture, like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. "We are concerned about you," Mrs. Thornton continued, stirring her tea with delicate precision. "The incident the other day, well, it's got people talking." "I imagine it has," Margaret replied, keeping her voice level. "You see, dear, we understand that as a widow you might feel isolated, vulnerable to certain influences." Mrs. Rawlings leaned forward, her eyes cold despite her maternal tone. "But defending that Indian against my Thomas and his friends, well, it suggests a concerning lack of judgment." Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I'm sorry, but I fail to see how preventing a public humiliation demonstrates poor judgment." The 3 women exchanged meaningful glances. Mrs. Fletcher spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to moral pronouncements. "Margaret, that man is Apache. His people have killed settlers, burned homesteads, stolen children. The fact that he's learned to ape civilized behavior doesn't change what he is." "What he is," Margaret said quietly, "is a human being who is being treated cruelly, for no reason other than the color of his skin." Mrs. Thornton's facade of concern slipped slightly. "My dear girl, such sentiments might be fashionable in Boston or New York, but this is the Arizona territory. We have different realities here, different necessities, such as the necessity of humiliating a man in the street for the entertainment of a crowd, such as maintaining proper boundaries." Mrs. Rawlings snapped, her patience finally exhausted. "Between civilized people and savages, between white women and Indian men, those boundaries exist for very good reasons, and when they're crossed..." She let the threat hang in the air. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "Are you threatening me, Mrs. Rawlings?" "We're trying to help you," Mrs. Thornton interjected smoothly. "You run a respectable boarding house, Margaret. You've built a good life here, but respectability is fragile, especially for a woman in your position. It can be lost so easily." The message was crystal clear. Margaret looked at each woman in turn, seeing the satisfied certainty in their faces. They believed they held all the power, that a few words about community standards would be enough to bring her to heel. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "Ladies," Margaret said, rising gracefully from her chair, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare. However, I believe our conversation is finished." Mrs. Thornton's eyebrows rose. "Margaret, I don't think you understand the seriousness of..." "I understand perfectly." Margaret moved toward the door, making it clear the visit was over. "You're suggesting that I should have stood by and watched a man be degraded because of his race, and that my failure to do so marks me as unsuitable for polite society. I find such reasoning morally repugnant." The women gathered their things in frosty silence. As they reached the door, Mrs. Thornton turned back one final time. "I hope you'll reconsider your position, dear, for your own sake. The Ladies' Auxiliary meets tomorrow evening to discuss various community matters. Your name will undoubtedly come up." After they left, Margaret sat alone in her parlor, the implications of the visit settling around her like dust after a windstorm. The Ladies' Auxiliary essentially controlled the social fabric of Tucson's respectable society. If they decided she was unfit company, her boarding house would empty within a week. She was still contemplating her options when a soft knock came at her kitchen door. Through the window she saw Joseph Crow Feather standing on her back porch, his hat in his hands, his expression troubled. Margaret opened the door, acutely aware that even this simple act, speaking privately with an Apache man at her home, would be seen as scandalous if discovered. "Mr. Crow Feather," she said, keeping her voice low. "What brings you here?" "I needed to warn you," he said without preamble. "There's talk among some of the Apache bands. Word spread about what happened, about you defending me. Some of my people see it as—" He paused, searching for the right words. "As betrayal on my part. Accepting help from a white woman, especially publicly, is seen as weakness." Margaret felt her heart sink. "I've made trouble for you with your own people as well." "That's not why I'm here," Joseph said firmly. "I'm here because Tom Rawlings came out to where I'm working. He made threats." "Against you?" The bottom seemed to drop out of Margaret's stomach. "What kind of threats?" "He said that women who consort with savages sometimes have accidents, house fires mostly, usually when they're alone and can't call for help." Joseph's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hartford, these aren't empty words. I've seen what men like Rawlings do when they feel their authority has been challenged." Margaret leaned against the doorframe, suddenly feeling very tired. "So I'm to be punished by both communities for doing what I thought was right." "You could leave," Joseph said quietly. "Pack up, move somewhere else, start over where no one knows about this." The suggestion hung between them, logical and sensible. Margaret had the means to do exactly that. Her hidden wealth could take her anywhere she wanted to go, set her up comfortably in San Francisco or Denver or any number of places where this incident would be forgotten. "Is that what you're going to do?" she asked. Joseph shook his head. "I can't. This is the only place I've found where I can earn an honest living using the education they forced on me. If I run every time someone threatens me, I'll spend my whole life running." "Then why are you suggesting I run?" "Because you have choices I don't have. Because you're not trapped between two worlds that both reject you." His voice carried a pain that made her chest ache. "Because you deserve better than what this town is going to give you." Margaret looked into his dark eyes and saw something that took her breath away, genuine concern for her welfare, despite his own precarious situation. When was the last time someone had worried about her well-being without expecting something in return? "Mr. Crow-Feather," she said slowly, "may I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "Do you believe what happened between us the other day? My intervention, this conversation, was wrong?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment, considering. "No," he said finally. "It was dangerous, maybe foolish, but not wrong." "Then neither of us should run." Margaret straightened her shoulders, feeling a familiar resolve settle over her. "I've been hiding for 3 years, Mr. Crow-Feather, pretending to be someone I'm not, keeping my head down, avoiding anything that might draw attention. I think I'm tired of hiding." "Margaret," Joseph said, and the use of her first name sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "You don't understand what you're choosing. This won't end with social ostracism or threats. Men like Rawlings, when they can't control someone, they destroy them." "Perhaps," Margaret said, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I'd rather face that than spend the rest of my life wondering who I might have been if I'd had the courage to be myself." Something shifted in Joseph's expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition. "You're not what I expected," he said softly. "What did you expect? Another well-meaning white woman who'd retreat the moment things got difficult?" He paused. "I'm glad I was wrong." As Margaret watched him disappear into the gathering dusk, she realized that her carefully constructed life was about to change irrevocably. The question was no longer whether she could avoid the storm ahead, but whether she could weather it without losing everything that mattered, including the unexpected connection she was beginning to feel with a man who understood what it meant to live between worlds. The ladies' auxiliary meeting convened on a Thursday evening in the church basement, and by Friday morning, Margaret's fate was sealed. Mrs. Chen left first, apologizing quietly in broken English as she packed her few belongings. Young Tom Miller followed that afternoon, stammering excuses about finding lodging closer to the bank. Mr. Weatherby, the old prospector, held out until Saturday before Sheriff Morrison came by to suggest he might be more comfortable elsewhere. Margaret stood in her empty boarding house that evening, watching the last traces of sunlight fade over the desert mountains. The silence felt profound after months of footsteps overhead, muffled conversations through thin walls, the comfortable rhythms of people going about their daily lives. Now she faced the very real prospect of losing everything she'd worked to build. A sharp knock at her front door broke through her melancholy. She opened it to find Dr. Samuel Brennan, a man she'd known casually for 2 years, recently widowed himself, respectable, and possessed of what many would consider reasonable prospects for a woman in her situation. "Mrs. Hartford," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Of course not, Dr. Brennan. Please come in." He settled into her parlor with the air of a man conducting important business. Margaret poured coffee, noting how his eyes assessed her furnishings, her dress, the subtle signs of financial strain that recent events had forced her to display. "I'll come straight to the point," Brennan said after accepting his cup. "I'm aware of your recent difficulties with certain members of our community. I want you to know that I don't share their harsh judgment." "That's very kind of you. I'm a practical man, Margaret. May I call you Margaret?" He didn't wait for permission. "I understand that as a widow, you've been placed in an impossible situation. No doubt you felt compelled to act as you did out of some misguided Christian charity." Margaret bristled at his condescending tone, but kept her voice level. "I acted according to my conscience, Dr. Brennan. Of course. A woman's tender heart can sometimes lead her astray." He leaned forward, his expression becoming earnest. "But that's precisely why a woman needs guidance, protection, a man's steadier judgment to help her navigate complicated situations." The direction of his conversation became clear, and Margaret felt her stomach clench. "Dr. Brennan, I'm prepared to offer you marriage," he said, cutting her off with the air of a man conferring a great favor. Despite recent events, a quiet ceremony naturally followed by a suitable period of retirement from public life while the community's memory fades. "I have a modest practice, enough to keep us comfortable, and I believe I can guide you back toward more appropriate behavior." Margaret stared at him, momentarily speechless. The audacity of his proposal, framed as rescue from her own poor judgment, left her breathless with indignation. "I appreciate your offer," she managed finally, "but I must decline." Brennan's eyebrows rose. "Margaret, I don't think you fully understand your position. Your boarding house is empty. Your reputation is in ruins. Without a husband's protection, you'll be lucky to find work as a laundress or seamstress. This is likely the best offer you'll receive. Nevertheless, my answer is no." His face hardened. "May I ask why? Surely you don't still harbor romantic notions at your age?" Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Dr. Brennan, I appreciate that you believe you're being generous, but I would rather face whatever hardships await me alone than marry a man who sees my independence of thought as something to be corrected." "Independence of thought?" Brennan's voice rose slightly. "Is that what you call defending Indians against white men? Margaret, that's not independence, that's dangerous delusion." "I believe our conversation is finished," Margaret said, rising from her chair. Brennan stood as well, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You're making a terrible mistake. When winter comes and you're facing starvation, remember that you had an opportunity for security and threw it away out of stubborn pride." After he left, Margaret sank back into her chair, the weight of her isolation pressing down like the desert heat. Brennan was right about one thing. Her options were severely limited. A woman alone in the territory faced genuine hardships, especially one whose reputation had been destroyed. She was still contemplating her bleak prospects when another knock came, this time at her kitchen door. Joseph stood on her back porch again, but this time his expression was different, more urgent, more personal. "Mrs. Hartford," he said as she let him in, "I heard about your boarders leaving. I'm sorry." "News travels fast in a small town," Margaret replied, grateful for his genuine sympathy. "There's something else. Tom Rawlings was in the saloon last night, drinking heavily and talking about how he plans to teach uppity women their place. Some of the men were encouraging him." Joseph's jaw tightened. "I don't think you should stay here alone." Margaret looked around her kitchen, the carefully maintained stove, the clean counters, the small touches that had made this place feel like home. "This is my house, Mr. Crow Feather. I won't be driven out by threats. Even if those threats turn into action, where would I go? I have no family, no friends who would take me in after what's happened. This house is all I have." Joseph was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's not entirely true." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "What do you mean?" "I mean you have choices you haven't considered." He took a deep breath. "Margaret, I've been thinking about what you said, about being tired of hiding, about having the courage to be yourself. Yes? What if we gave them something real to talk about?" Margaret's heart began to beat faster. "Joseph, what are you suggesting?" "Marriage," he said simply. "I'm suggesting we get married." The word hung in the air between them like something alive and dangerous. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible." "Is it?" "Legally, there's nothing preventing it. Socially, yes, it would be scandalous. But we're already scandalized, both of us. At least this way we'd face it together." Margaret stared at him, trying to process what he was proposing. Marriage to an Apache man in 1882 Arizona would be more than scandalous. It would be social suicide, potentially physically dangerous. and would mark them both as permanent outcasts. "Joseph," she said slowly, "you can't be serious. The consequences would be severe." "I know that." He stepped closer, his dark eyes intense. "But Margaret, I've been alone for so long, caught between worlds belonging to neither. For the first time in years, I've met someone who sees me as more than a curiosity or a threat, someone who stood up for me when she had no obligation to do so." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "But marriage, that's not something to enter into lightly, especially under these circumstances." "No, it isn't." Joseph's voice was quiet but firm. "But I've watched you these past days. I've seen your courage, your refusal to compromise your principles even when it costs you everything. I've fallen in love with that strength, Margaret. With you." The simple declaration hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the kitchen table, her knees suddenly weak. "Joseph, I know it's not what you expected to hear. I know I'm not what any woman plans for her future, but I'm offering you partnership, respect, and protection, such as I can provide. And more than that, I'm offering you the chance to choose your own path, even if it's a difficult one." Margaret looked into his face and saw sincerity, vulnerability, and something else that made her heart race, genuine affection mixed with desire. The possibility he presented was terrifying, yes, but also liberating in a way she'd never imagined. "There's something you should know," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "About my circumstances. I'm not as poor as people believe." Joseph's eyebrows rose. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a shaky breath, then made a decision that would change everything. "My husband left me quite well provided for. Very well provided for, actually. I have investments, property deeds, money in banks, enough to live comfortably anywhere I choose." Joseph stared at her, processing this revelation. "Then why live like a struggling widow? Because a wealthy woman alone draws attention I couldn't afford. Marriage proposals from fortune hunters, pressure from men who think they can manage my money better than I can. I chose poverty as a disguise. And you're telling me this because?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Because if we're going to do this impossible thing, we should do it honestly. You should know that marrying me would bring financial security along with social disaster." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Margaret Hartford, you are full of surprises. Is that a yes?" He stepped forward and took her hands in his touch sending warmth up her arms. "That's a yes, if you'll have me." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, his dark, work-roughened, capable, hers pale, soft, trembling slightly with emotion. Such a simple thing, this touching of skin, but it felt like revolution. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you." As Joseph leaned down to kiss her gently, Margaret realized she was about to embark on the most dangerous and exhilarating adventure of her life. Tomorrow, they would begin planning a future that defied every convention of their time and place. Tonight, for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. The wedding took place at dawn on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Joseph's proposal. They met at the small Catholic mission 20 miles south of Tucson, where Father Miguel, an elderly priest who had ministered to both Apache and Mexican communities for decades, agreed to perform the ceremony despite its controversial nature. Margaret wore her best dress, a deep blue silk that brought out her eyes, and carried a small bouquet of desert wildflowers that Joseph had picked at sunrise. He stood beside her in a new white shirt and dark jacket, his long hair braided with traditional Apache silver ornaments that caught the early light streaming through the mission's simple windows. "Are you certain about this?" Father Miguel asked them one final time, his weathered face grave with concern. "The path you're choosing will not be easy." Margaret looked at Joseph, seeing the steady strength in his dark eyes, the quiet dignity that had first drawn her to defend him. Over the past weeks, their late-evening conversations had revealed a man of remarkable intelligence and unexpected humor, someone who understood loss and resilience in ways that made her feel less alone in the world. "We're certain, Father," she said firmly. The ceremony was simple, conducted in both English and Spanish, with traditional Apache prayers that Joseph spoke in his native tongue. When they exchanged vows, Margaret felt the weight of what they were undertaking. Not just marriage, but a deliberate challenge to every social convention of their time. "By the power vested in me by God and the Church," Father Miguel concluded, "I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Joseph kissed her gently, Margaret heard the mission bells ringing across the desert, announcing their union to the vast Arizona sky. They honeymooned, if it could be called that, in a small cabin on the ranch where Joseph had been working. The owner, Don Carlos Mendoza, was a pragmatic man who valued Joseph's skill with horses above social prejudices. He offered them sanctuary until they could make other arrangements. It was there in the quiet intimacy of their first week as husband and wife that they planned their future. Margaret revealed the full extent of her wealth, enough to buy land, start a business, or travel anywhere in the world. Joseph spoke of his dreams beyond mere survival, using his education to help bridge the gap between Apache and white communities, perhaps starting a school where both cultures could learn from each other. "We could go to California," Margaret suggested one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "Start fresh where no one knows our history." Joseph considered this, then shook his head. "Running away won't solve anything, and if we're going to make a life together, I want it to be authentic, not built on hiding who we are." "Then what do you suggest?" "We go back to Tucson, face whatever comes, show them that our marriage is real, built on love and respect, not scandal or defiance." He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Margaret, I've spent too many years trying to fit into other people's expectations. I want to live honestly, even if it's difficult." Margaret squeezed his hand, feeling a familiar surge of admiration for his courage. "And if they make it impossible for us to stay, then we'll know we tried, and we'll decide together what comes next." Their return to Tucson after 2 weeks created exactly the uproar they'd expected. News of their marriage had spread during their absence, and the town was divided between those who saw it as an abomination and those who were simply shocked into silence. Margaret's boarding house had been vandalized, windows broken, "Savage Lover" painted across the front door in crude red letters. But there were surprises as well. Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of the few female physicians in the territory, came calling their second day back. A Mexican woman who had faced her own share of prejudice, she offered medical services and quiet friendship. Old Pete Kowalski from the livery stable made a point of greeting them respectfully on the street, his simple nod speaking volumes about character over convention. Most unexpectedly, 3 Apache women appeared at their door one morning, Joseph's aunt and 2 cousins who had traveled from the reservation. Margaret served them coffee with shaking hands, acutely aware that this meeting could determine whether Joseph retained any connection to his heritage. The conversation was conducted primarily in Apache, with Joseph translating key points. Margaret watched the women's faces, noting the shrewd intelligence in their eyes as they assessed her, asked questions, and listened to Joseph's responses. Finally, the eldest woman, Joseph's Aunt Maria, spoke directly to Margaret in halting English. "My nephew says you have courage, that you stood against your own people to defend him." "Yes," Margaret replied simply. "He says you choose love over safety." "I did." Maria studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. Apache women know this choice. We know what it means to love a man other people fear." She paused, then added, "You are welcome in our family, white woman, but you must be strong. The path you walk will test everything you believe about yourself." The blessing of Joseph's family provided strength for the challenges that followed. Tom Rawlings and his supporters made life difficult. Suppliers refused to sell to them. The bank questioned every transaction, and threatening notes appeared regularly under their door. But Margaret's hidden wealth proved crucial. She could afford to shop in other towns, to weather the economic pressure, to outlast those who hoped to starve them into submission. 6 months after their wedding, as autumn painted the desert in burnished gold, Margaret stood in the garden behind their house, the former boarding house, now converted to a comfortable home for 2. Joseph was working with a young Apache boy, teaching him to read English while learning traditional stories in return. Margaret placed a hand on her still flat stomach, smiling at the secret she would share with Joseph that evening. Their child would be born into a complicated world, belonging fully to neither culture, but creating something new from both. "Mrs. Crow Feather," Joseph called, using the name that still thrilled her 6 months later. "Come settle an argument about whether this story is funnier in English or Apache." As Margaret walked toward her husband and his student, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had lost her carefully constructed anonymity, her social standing, and her safe, predictable life. In return, she had gained love, purpose, and the exhilarating freedom of living authentically. The path ahead remained uncertain. Arizona territory was changing slowly but inevitably, and they would be part of that change whether they chose to be or not. Their marriage was a small revolution, challenging assumptions about race, culture, and the possibility of love transcending social boundaries. But as Joseph smiled at her approach, his dark eyes warm with affection and respect, Margaret knew they would face whatever came together. They had already proven that courage and love could overcome the most entrenched prejudices. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. Like their love, it demanded strength to survive, but for those who could endure, it offered space to become something extraordinary. Margaret Hartford Crow Feather had finally stopped hiding, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged.